welcome to our show, What Now? This is our third episode, and we are happy that we are joined by a very esteemed guest today, John Cobb Jr., which my co-host Mark Anielski would be introducing to everybody. And joined here with us is John Hilbrey, our friend, dear friend, and sort of a co-host as well, because the idea came with John Hilbrey as well. So I'm just going to, just a quick rundown of the previous two episodes, and to see how we are now building towards, and we are going towards an ecological civilization that John would be talking about today. So we started off with real management that John Hilbrey and Tom Thies talk about. And real management is basically working with the real nature of people rather than going against it. And then we had my friend Sarah Rator yesterday. And Sarah was also talking about especially policy making, how in this environment of uncertainty, we can imagine that how policymakers can now bring in the feeling and love factor as well and work from there. So today we would be exploring ecological civilization, which is basically about harmony between human life and nature. And before we start that, I'm just going to share one quick reflection with you. Because as I was last night, I was on call with my spiritual teacher and guide, Ph.D. Inayat Khan, and we were exploring the animal self, or the animal soul in human nature. So what Ph.D. said was very interesting. So he said that this pandemic has actually brought to light all the injustices that already exist in our world. And especially, remember the bat? So he said that the virus comes from the animals, right? And it actually shows the imbalance of our relationship with animals, that, you know, it's like what he said was like a Holocaust against animals, that we've been, you know, treating them so badly. So I think there is a bridge here, that how do we now think about having a world with ecological civilization, that we live in harmony with nature as well. So over to you now, Mark. You can take on from here.
Well, thanks,
Welcome,
Anika.
John.
So just to our listening audience, this is an idea that Anika, and just having met John probably like 14 days ago, I think, John, remarkable relationships we have. I just want to introduce John Cobb Jr., who has been my mentor for many years, co-author with Herman Daly of the book, I call it The Bible on Sustainability for the Common Good, which really laid out an amazing roadmap for a new economy. And then I remember meeting John in person, bugging him, asking, why in the second edition did you have a chapter on money in the afterword, in the back of the book? And John said, well, because Herman told me he didn't know anything about money. And so John and I have been friends ever since then. I've worked with his son Cliff on the U.S. Genuine Progress Indicator. John wrote the foreword to my new book, and Herman Daly wrote the foreword to my Economics of Happiness book. John's amazing. You've just turned 95. You're still as lucid. You look way better than Noam Chomsky, I must say. And we were just together in Seoul, Korea, in October, and John, you know, stood stoutly on his feet and gave amazing wisdom lectures about this idea of an ecological civilization, which is something China has embraced remarkably. And some little anecdotes about John. I believe, John, you were born in Hiroshima before the bomb. You grew up in your younger years.
My childhood was Hiroshima, but I was actually born in Kobe.
In Kobe, right. But I remember you telling me how you went back to Kobe and Hiroshima, and you discovered that the school you went to was no longer there. But
I could find very little. Yeah.
So we'd like to talk to you about what you see. I mean, this show is about not just, where we've come from, because we can spend a lot of time on that, but, in this very moment of, I would call it an illumination of conscience, we're at this kind of tipping point where we're at a juncture we can choose which direction we want to take. And this idea of ecological civilization I find quite compelling. And again, the West knows very little about this, but it seems like the Asian nations are embracing this. So thank you, John, for joining us.
Well, thank you. Well, I have been trying to imagine for 50 years what a kind of a world could be sustainable. We learned around the late 1960s that the global society we now have is behaving in unsustainable ways. And for a few years, there was a movement strong enough to actually get good legislation passed in the United States. But we were, after that, fragmented, and everybody was supposed to work on some specific problem. And since then, the corporate world has taken over again, or just retaken the dominance. And there's been no good legislation, and the global economy has become more unsustainable. And war is relied upon as much as ever. And of course, a war would be the most totally disastrous. It would be hard to prevent a major war from becoming a nuclear war. And the nuclear war has the possibility of ending human life. It wouldn't have to, I don't mean, but it's awful to think of. So it has been discouraging to watch for 50 years after we already know that what we're doing is going to lead to our self-destruction, to see that, well, we just do it more. So every now and again, I get a glimmer of hope that change might really happen. And I think that, we've been talking about all kinds of calamities that we were going to face, disasters of various kinds. And we didn't talk a lot about plague. That usually got listed when we were listing the kinds of things that might happen. But when it actually happens, it has a power to shape thinking that just recognizing that it was inevitable did not have. So there is a possibility now that we will learn that the radical globalization and technologization and all the things that have happened in the past, continue to happen in the past 50 years, that we will recognize that survival depends upon people being able to survive locally. If you can only survive by bringing in food from 1,000 miles, there will be disasters that put an end to that kind of thing. And since my efforts have gone in the direction of creating or supporting the development of local self-sufficient communities, and of course I don't think there are many like that now, but nevertheless there are ones which depend less, much less, upon distant technologies and distant production. China is far more promising in this respect than any other major country. I don't know enough about Bhutan, but it may be more prominent. You understand, I'm not trying to say no one else is doing it and doing it better, but China's doing it is an immensely important thing. Now, the term ecological civilization is one that I learned from China. China got it from UN documents some decades ago. But the Chinese were having great success in modernizing, but they experienced the cost of modernizing very vividly in ecological negative. And I think that the Communist Party, which cares more about public opinion than the US government does, really wanted to assure people that they were not destined for a world in which breathing was going to be a difficult problem because of pollution of the air, and water was all going to be polluted and so forth. And so they wrote into the constitution of the Communist Party that the goal was ecological civilization. Now, they didn't define it. And it was because of Zhe Wang's presence in Claremont, and
California.
he is a member of the Academy of Social Sciences, which is very influential in China, and his connections in China, that his friends encouraged him to hold a conference on that topic. And so I think we held a conference on that topic in Claremont with primarily 4 Chinese guests before it was announced in China. And we've held one every year, and these have played a role in explaining what ecological civilization is. And one of the things we focused on was that if you want an ecological civilization, you need to have an ecological communities as a base. You can't have an ecological civilization that is totally top-down. When things are organized for 1 billion people, and decisions about 1 billion people are all made at one place, you can create the conditions that make possible better than you can if you have a democratic government that spends all of its time doing what the corporations want. But it's not an ecological civilization that you are developing. So the government has made moves in the direction of improving the relationship to the natural world that are very important, and I don't want to minimize them at all. But we were emphasizing the importance of local communities, and this has resulted in, or at least it has contributed to, who knows what all the causal factors are. I certainly don't. But in any case, the national government has very strongly adopted the policy of developing the villages. Now, the villages have suffered greatly over the last 20 or 30 years. Really been, I mean, very few of them have been economically functional. People have been leaving the villages in millions and tens of millions, even hundreds of millions. So to decide they didn't want to continue that path, but rather to reverse it and to really act on that was a significant change. So right now, in the last 2 or 3 years, more people have been moving from cities to villages than from villages to cities. This does not mean the problem is solved. I hope you understand. But it does mean that to talk in China about the development of relatively self-sufficient villages that could be encouraged to give a great deal more attention to agriculture and to make China again self-sufficient in food production, which it is not now by any means, but was, 25, 30 years ago, it was largely self-sufficient. So what we are working for in China is a reversal of many of the basic policies, but building upon real commitments by the government that have had positive expression. So that is not to say a great deal about what ecological civilization is, but to indicate historically what the situation is that makes a discussion of ecological civilization not just fantasy, but relating to the situation of the world's most populous nation.
John, can I juxtapose the ecological civilization? I was senior advisor to China between 2003 and 6 on actually to and through the Academy of Social Sciences, which Wang is part of or has been part of. And our goal as advisors, I was a Canadian advisor on green GDP, so adding pollution and other environmental degradation costs to the national income accounts GDP, which is my expertise. But I thought more importantly was they retained me as an advisor on their national economic policy, which is called Xiaokang, which means, actually it's a Confucian word, means moderately well-off Chinese, or as a professor of philosophy, the dean of philosophy in Shanghai Normal University said, it actually means well-being, Mark. You're absolutely correct from a Westerner's perspective. So you've nailed it. And I was laughing because we talk about the origin of the virus. Well, I was wearing, as I know you've worn the Chinese jackets, and I was wearing with Professor Bao the symbol of happiness, red jacket, silk jacket with the emblem of happiness was 5 bats in a circle, right? Remarkable when you think about, if this Wuhan virus came from the bat. But I know I digress a bit, but can you talk about how you see, the West, the Western mind doesn't know anything about this Xiaokang. It's amazing. Since 1979, that's been their national economic strategy, which has meant that to raise GDP to a certain level, so the average Chinese person is well off. And like you said, I was even suggesting to them that you should be careful about driving the rural population into Shanghai and Beijing, and maintaining the land stewards on the land and maintaining healthy soil and healthy productivity. So how do you see like this Xiaokang and this ecological civilization possibly being a way forward for the rest of us?
Well, I think that the Chinese have done a remarkable job in bringing 500 million people out of poverty. And certainly they have not made them rich by our standards. We would still consider them very poor. But they are no longer poor by the UN measures of poverty, which are radical. I mean, in other words, they are not hungry. They have clothing. They have the necessities of life. And I think the ones who also have a healthy community can be just as happy as people who have a great many more goods. Now, the healthy community is not guaranteed, but I think China has a better sense of the importance of some kinds of community than the West does. The idea of community has simply not played any role in economic thought or even in sociological thought in the West. And that to me is really shocking. It means that the idea of individuals, and essentially competitive individuals, is the foundation of our whole theory of what human life is all about. And of course, there have been lots of people who have written otherwise. I don't mean that you and I are alone in this, but if you go to university departments and ask them, what do they teach about community? I think you'll have a hard time finding. And yet the idea of having people live together in groups where people think that the well-being of the group is extremely important to their own individual well-being. I mean, that happens all the time. It's a normal matter. And it was happening much more all over the world until we modernized and destroyed the existing communities. Just said, but look, they've got more money. Well, but they're also more miserable. And how long does that have to go on before people raise the question? It has been really painful to try to maintain some kind of hope and patience when you see such stupidity, because we know better. We have plenty of knowledge. We have plenty of evidence.
I share your pain, John. I was in Zimbabwe just 3 weeks ago, and we were in this village. It's quite a poor, by world standard, like a poor village. But you know, I was so touched by how people were sort of connected together. You know, they sort of respect their elders, and nothing matters. It's like time just stops there. You know, it's nothing else. It's about how you are, you know, the human connection. I'm just fascinated. I was like, wow, I'm in paradise. And my friends in London and everywhere, they think this woman has lost her mind, because they're like, are you crazy? You are in a village. And I was like, oh my God, this is paradise. I want to live here. And I was saying, you know what? Since last year, I've been saying our cities are becoming so crowded. And you know, when you feel like something is building up, and I'm saying I need to move to a village where, you know, I can breathe and just be normal and happy. And here we are. Now we've built these cities, you know, with all the decadence and whatever. And look what is happening to us. Sorry to just, I had to share with you, because what you were saying was exactly how I feel about this. Yeah.
No, there are millions of people who feel that way. We're not working. It's simply that the intellectual structures that we have inherited and that our universities celebrate. I'm so disgusted with the fact that Harvard University announces accurately that it is a value-free research university. And a leading educator writes a book and tells teachers, save the world on your own time. That is not what the university employs you for. In other words, I suppose wisest people, I guess, I don't know what label to put, because wisdom is not part of the curriculum of university. But the people who spent the most years in school, we put it, that's an accurate description, have been persuaded of the Kantian total separation of facts and values, and they think that the only thing that matters is the facts, and that to spend any time on values, such little values as saving the world from self-destruction, no, you mustn't pay attention to that. That's a value. Values are.
And jobs and professions. That's what matters.
I mean, that's so insane that I sometimes have trouble restraining myself from screaming.
Screaming.
I just love the fact you call it schooling system and not education, because of this competition there. And can I share a recent example? Because of this pandemic, you know, the kids can't now sit for exams, right? GCSEs. And imagine they are so upset, the mothers are upset, and they're saying, oh, my child is sulking because he can't sit for the exams. And I was like, are you crazy? If I was a student, I would be just jumping up and down. I don't want to sit for an exam. Why? So, you know, we've come to this. But
Yes, well, it has been sad to me that young people have cooperated so fully as we take away their childhood. This is more extreme in China. I mean, this is not a place I'm going to hold up China as a good model. But for them, teaching for the exam is not something that is regarded slightly critically. That's what the schools are for. And there was a very sad occasion, maybe 25 years ago. I'm very poor at this kind of thing, when the government actually invited a Whiteheadian educator to come up with a experimental curriculum. And I asked, well, how many students were involved? Oh, 20 million. So experiments in China are on a scale that's not trivial. And she did, and they started on the curriculum, and I think that things were going pretty well. But the parents were terrified that their children would not do as well on the exam because they weren't memorizing as much of the stuff that goes on the exam. And so they had to give it up. So until they can give up the exam system or radically modify it, I think maybe having several different types of exams would be very helpful as a first step. And of course, the exams are entirely for, schools are entirely for urban life. They always have been.
Yeah, yeah.
But
factories,
what
they're
China
like factories.
needs is to go back to its rural life. And so the whole thing is doing much more harm than good. In this country also, I expect education does more harm than good. But
John,
we
can you
seriously need to deschool the society.
Yeah.
Yes,
John, can I love your reflection, because what you're saying is, there is no perfect there's no perfect nation here. There's no perfect model here. But one thing that struck me, when I went to Beijing, I would go to the Forbidden City because it was the quietest place in Beijing. And for $10, I could hide and get lost in these amazing labyrinths. And then I would read the wisdom of Emperor Qianlong, the great emperor from the Qing dynasty. And then I read the history. Oh, the British came and wanted to free trade with you. And you said, no, thanks. We already have enough stuff. We don't need to buy your junk or whatever. And of course, then they started the Opium War through Hong Kong, and the rest is history. But
the Opium Wars are a good illustration of the values that the West has.
Yeah. So my question is,
increasing the total economy, more trade is so important that it doesn't matter what you trade.
Right.
And it doesn't matter how much you destroy a culture.
So this ancient 5,000-year civilization, which has Taoist roots, the Emperor Qianlong said, my role as emperor is to balance heaven and earth, he said. What? He was a great devotee of the Pancha Lama and the Dalai Lama. He was, so this yin and yang, this role of emperor, I don't know if we see those kind of leaders right now. And what's your thought in terms of, you're the world's probably longest.
Well, I think one of the reasons that I'm hopeful about China is that if it can scrape off the veneer of Western modernism, but also change its goals of schooling. I mean, there are a few other things. Because the exam system goes back to ancient Chinese tradition. But nevertheless, even its communism, when it had some of the things that we don't like, I mean, there are a lot of things about communism in China I like, but that is Marxism with Chinese characteristics. And many of them welcomed the book that Philip Clayton wrote on organic Marxism. Philip's point was that the heart of Marxism was the passion for social justice and the way money gets made and distributed and so forth. And he was all for that. But he said Marx wrote at a time when mechanistic models were universal. I mean, the organic models just weren't there. But I think that Marxism with Chinese characteristics tends to be organic Marxism. And Philip's book was so much appreciated that there was a reaction from hardline Marxists, and we were accused of being American spies and Christian missionaries and all kinds of things. But we weathered that, and it made us much better known in China because newspapers love to tell about controversies. So lots of people heard of us. Anyway, the whole context is such that the things I want to say are rather readily understood. And as you were saying, China has not given up the use of the GDP. And it evaluates its governors of provinces equally by how they're doing on GDP and how they're doing on the environment. Well, that's a wonderful improvement over the way in which most things get done in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But if they use a sensible measure, they don't have to divide it up. The GDP measure still gives plus to many things that should be minus.
Mm-hmm.
And so I keep hoping I do. In China, when I say I hope they will change, it's not just fantasy. If I said, oh, I hope the US will give up using GDP within a few years, I mean, that I think that's a waste of hope. But it's not a waste of hope in China or Korea. I think that they do know that GDP is not a good measure of anything worthwhile. And they may need to still use it in order to make reports to World Trade Organization or whoever, but they don't need to use it for their own internal purposes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really hoping your experience there was, they were taking seriously the possibility of using a better measure.
They're very serious, yes.
And there are lots of areas. I think that my urging that China become food self-sufficient can be heard in China. Now, that means reversing tendent changes in diet. And once they had more money, they wanted more meat. And as you know, meat takes often 10 times as much space so that you can produce a great many more calories of vegetables and grains than you can of meat. And since the meat is not an essential part of Chinese cuisine, I don't mean you have to give it up altogether, but the amount that was being consumed by the average Chinese 50 years ago was a minor matter, and perfectly okay to have occasional salad, all that kind of thing. I'm not interested, but these days we can artificially produce something that tastes very much like meat and can even fool people out of vegetables.
Yeah.
The need for the cruel, brutal treatment, bestial treatment, I don't know what word to use, that way we produce meat in this country. And I think in Europe, there's a lot of the same thing. That's been exported now to China. That's a reversal in that respect is possible in China. I don't think it's impossible. And that would be one big step toward becoming self-sufficient. Another big step would be to really work at good farming in the countryside. Once you move people back to the countryside, thus far, it has not been in order to farm. And therefore, farming in China has deteriorated terribly.
I think
It's
all
Monsanto.
Yeah. I want to ask John Hilbery to make some commentary too, but I think you touched on something really important as an economist who studied like Adam Smith. When I read Wealth of Nations, I always tease him because he said he never defined the word wealth, which in the Old English means the conditions of well-being, because he was Scottish, I guess. I don't know why. But
Um,
you know,
and I pick up the invisible hand.
yeah.
What?
Well, and of course, his more famous, well, less famous book, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, fascinating read. But Smith argued that countries trade. Portugal and England will trade because Britain produces better wheat and Portugal produces better Madeira or port wine, and therefore the Brits want to drink port wine and Portuguese want to have bread. And so this goes against our current, this globalized trade model, which is moving stuff around the planet, rice from America to China and vice versa. Absolutely ridiculous, inefficient. And what this pandemic, I think, is showing us is that we can live more ecologically sustainably from the biocapacity of our respective lands. We can live on a 100-mile diet if we choose to. At least let's give it a shot. Yeah. And we'll be happier. We'll be village-like you experienced, Anika, in Africa. And I'm like, this has to be the path to happiness. I mean, and there's no reason we can't. We can go back to we don't all have to be on a plant-based diet. I would love to believe that is possible. But to me, this is an exciting possibility that we will start to think more local and act more local.
I
Plus,
think
we imagine
the quest for happiness and the quest for community are virtually identical.
Yes.
And this imagined scarcity, we believe there's this imagined scarcity, whereas, we have abundance of food. I was telling John that, I go to my local shop and there's abundance of everything still. Yeah. And we still believe we'll die because we are in lockdown and what's going to happen. So I think abundance has been actually exploited by us, especially in cities and urban areas. We have so much food to eat that now we're becoming fat. And now going back to
I can tell you right now, when I'm not doing any exercising, I'm having real trouble not putting the pounds on.
I bet.
No.
Should we ask John to come in?
My whole life has been luxurious. I mean, not by billionaire standards, but by world standards.
Yes.
I just take for granted all kinds of way beyond my needs.
Yeah, I think this is what I keep telling Mark. You don't know what privilege is, because it's, we haven't lived that life, and we can just romanticize poverty all day long. Yeah. Unless those who are living it know what poverty is.
No, and it's not that people don't have suffering and want, and I mean there are all kinds of problems in any community, however healthy. But I was very struck when people were doing measures of happiness around the world, that Japan, which has I think it's one of the healthier capitalist economies.
It is.
Have the extremes of wealth and poverty. I don't think anybody is really suffering miserably from poverty in Japan, and so forth and so on. I mean, I'm trying to make sure you understand it's a kind of model, but the people in Japan are not nearly as happy as the people in Okinawa.
That's right.
And the reason, I think, is because Okinawa hasn't been developed so well, and therefore there's still extended families.
They still have many centurions there because of their diet, because of the community, because of the associations. The women get together every day and, socialize, because that's what we are supposed to do,
Exactly. Yeah.
So, John.
So the idea of that, if you only get people out of poverty and make them have middle class, that's a solution to anything. It's not a solution to anything. It's the destruction of the planet.
Exactly. And the definition of poverty, I mean, who's given that definition? It's again coming from people of privilege. They have bracketed these people as these are the poor people. I mean, anyways, I keep talking about
there is a kind of poverty that we really must eliminate. For people not to know where their next meal is coming from, that's not happiness.
Yeah.
That's not
And,
happiness.
in this country, we have lots of homeless people and not
Yes.
having a place to live and being pushed around by police because they don't want you to sleep on the sidewalk. I mean, that's not happiness.
No, of course
So
not.
I want to ask John Hilbery to make some reflections. John Cobb, you don't know John, but John was part of a very important, one of the largest banks in the world in his career, an amazing young man at the time. And look at him now, he looks amazing at 80, you know, and he's in Sesimbra on the edge of, you know, Europe, in Portugal. So he shared a lot of his wisdom with me, and so I want him to reflect on what you've said.
John, I'm not a young man, not as old as you are, but you may have just started a revolution here. I am hugely impressed. Thank you so much. I won't say any more, but you've made a very big impression upon me. I live in a village called Sesimbra. About 20 years ago, it had 5,000 people and fishermen. And it was a very successful fishing village. And on the hills behind, we had the farmers. So we had the luxury of abundant fish.
Mm-hmm.
We had the luxury of abundant local produce.
Mm-hmm.
We were a sustainable community of 5,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
European Union has destroyed it. And yet we have, and this would be heard in the village, I know, we have a communist and not a Marxist government. And we have a very active Catholic community. I see, as the world fragments, possibly, it may coalesce also, unity may be achieved. But I see actually a greater likelihood of greater fragmentation for a period of time. I can even see this place in which I live, which now has 1,000 people, and during the winter, even less, perhaps 14 families and 500 people. I can see this reverting to the village it was 25, 30 years ago. And your words have inspired me to bring them all together and tell them this possibility that they can either join with Lisbon, the great city in the world, which they have done because it's now a tourist town, because it's been subverted from its natural activities towards being part of mass tourism market, which has destroyed so many places. So you've started the revolution in me, and I thank you very much for that. I won't go to sleep for at least 24, 48 hours. I'm going to dwell on what you're saying. And so many things you've said, I mean, just remarkable. I liked organic Marxism very much. Bestial treatment, I thought was stunning. Self-sufficiency, individual against the collective. Traditional or classical Harvard-based education and research. I've had no education whatsoever, by the way. I was brought up without education. I've grasped it by my own means. And I've survived by my own means. So I've had no education at all. I think I went to school.
Sounds to me like you have a lot of education, just not much schooling. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
We call it osmosis.
Thank you. Yes, this of course has been the route. It had to be. I had no alternative. But so I see in all you said such a clear indication of a possible old way. It's not a new way, it's an old way, but with the added benefits of new technology. Because if this village were to close itself down and make it a principality or a local community, we could shut the 3 roads into the town, we could close it off, we'd have farms on the hills, fish in the water, and I start educating the people. They'd have a school with me immediately, and there are many teachers here too. There are fishermen and sailors and windsurfers and people with great abilities and organic knowledge. I can see this becoming a new sort of mini state within the state. Revolution. The police will be here tonight and they'll take me away and lock me up. But so what you said is quite remarkable. And I did go to China in the early 80s. I saw what China was. I know what China is. It's absolutely extraordinary. And not all bad at all. So much good. But the image of China and the movement from the villages to the urban centers and vice versa. And the same applies to this village. It's a microcosm of everything you've just said to me. This village of Cibra is a microcosm of China. And strangely, of course, Portugal were the first people to go to China, cacao, and many of the people here understand the Chinese link. And who do we have here? Who's the new population here in this village? The Chinese, who've already started their encroachment. The Portuguese offered Macau back to China in the 80s, said, you cannot give back that which you don't own, wait. So I've always seen this as the open door. Portugal means, o Porto means the open door. And this is the open door to Brazil, it's the open door to China. Anyone can come in here from North Africa, and they do. They don't stay long because we're too poor. They go on to Germany and they go on to France. They look around, see the fish and say, we don't want to do that, that's hard work. So we do get this wave of migrants who quickly pass through us, those who stay intermarry. And so you see this multicultural, part Jewish, part Christian, part Islamic group people who've made up these villages. It's a integrated global whole. It's amazing. So I can see your story, forgive me for going on, but you inspired me. I can see your story being, your Chinese story being replicated here in this place. It's quite remarkable.
Thank you, John. Can I?
Thanks, John.
Sorry, go on.
No, you go on, Anika.
Let me just add one other thing, because I don't think that even if we had wonderful local villages all over, unless they felt a community of communities, that is, unless each village felt that they were not in competition with all their neighbors, rather that when their neighbors flourished, that helped them to flourish. And many things have to be done at a larger level than the local community. So I've imagined a community of communities of communities of communities up to the global level. I just wanted to mention that because there are great dangers in intense loyalty to a small group.
I fully understand.
And we've had, I mean, nations have been communities.
And tribes.
Nationalism has wonderful features. I mean, if a nation really cares for its people, that's great. But it so often is in competition with the other nation, and world wars take place and so forth. So we have to have both local communities, and then they have to understand themselves as part of larger ones. I mean, that's the only way I see humanity can survive.
Yes.
Can I make one plug before Anika, you want to try to, is a plug for John, you and I, it's probably part of your inspiration, but Populous, the group that we've co-created. I'm a forester. The greatest living organism is a stand of aspen, trembling aspen, Populus tremuloides in Latin. An amazing organism, over 10,000 years old, at least, maybe older, and living in symbiosis, in harmony. We're now learning that plants actually have language. They protect each other. They mutually enforce and love each other. And so I see nature as the model.
Yes.
And I'm reflecting on the word civilization, which to me just means civil. You know, are we going to be civil? Are we going to use nature as our model of civility?
Yes. Coming back to the animal self in us, because we do have a vegetable soul as well. Avicenna talked about it, that we have a vegetable soul, then we have an animal soul. Okay, so John, my question to you, or just a reflection, is I'm a self-proclaimed philosopher, if I may say so. And you know this, I was listening to one of your talks, and you know, you spoke about philosophy and practicality. There's always this divide because, you know, I mean, listening to everybody, you, John, Mark, we have this wisdom around, yet we get caught up in this vicious circle over and over again. So in the wake of now this pandemic, and everybody has this time to self-reflect and, you know, think about how can we be different? How can our communities be different? Let alone the world, or, you know, civilization is a big word, right?
Yeah.
So if you can share your wisdom that in your life, that, you know, philosophy is fine, we know philosophy, we study philosophy as a subject, you know, rather than it's, you know, it becomes like an intellectual practice as well. So could you share your wisdom with us regarding this?
Well, first, just let me say, I think philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
I wish there was some of it in our departments of philosophy in our schools.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's my question. Yeah, it was love of wisdom.
It has
Philosophy.
been systematically excluded by the academic discipline model. Once philosophy sets out to be an academic discipline, it cannot seek wisdom. It can only.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's just one of my many, many
Yes.
peeves. So certainly, I think I would love to see us, while we are not at our schools, think about what a real education would be.
Hmm.
And it would certainly not be organized into academic disciplines.
No. Hmm.
But we can imagine it. And I think in kindergarten, we sometimes do pretty well.
Could I interject to what you are saying? Because what I feel and I say is that that wisdom or that education exists within those communities that you and I are talking about, because they're sort of surviving or sustaining through that wisdom they have, or education, which is sort of, you know, the oral tradition coming from their elders, and, you know,
Oh, yeah.
they don't go to schools. And so it exists still, but then, you know, we have the arrogance of not considering that as education. We say education is you go to school and you get education and you get a certificate. So do you think now in this new world that we are imagining, would that be possible? That people can see the light, that, you know.
Can I ask one question before John speaks? John, a skill testing question. What's the Latin root of education?
Well, it's drawing forth, isn't it?
That's right.
And I have only recently really become aware of the extent to which our schools were created for the benefit of an industrial society. And I think they probably have served the industrial society quite well, so we shouldn't say they're a failure.
They're factories.
But if we want our children to be helped to become full human beings in healthy communities in a sustainable way, then schools simply to produce workers in the industrial world, not what we should be working on. So we just need to start over.
Yes, John?
Just, if I may, forgive me, very briefly. My experience has been that when I have met someone that I've admired and then grown to love, I grew to become fascinated by the subject that they most loved. And so whenever I've selected my own teachers, and they've all been passionate about something. Molecular biology, Beethoven, literature, history, whatever. And I've had my dozen or so teachers. And I've loved them very much. And they've loved their subjects very much. and somehow or other, I've acquired their knowledge. That's all I have to say. I think we actually have the capacity to absorb the knowledge of others through a union of love. Loving the teacher, loving the subject, and absorbing it from them. And it becomes yours.
And love of knowledge as well, because imagine the world tomorrow wouldn't have the jobs that we had. It would be a new world. People won't even have those jobs to go back to. So where do we go from there? I think we should end at this note.
I'd like to end, but I would like to tell I'm going to send this video to our 20-year-old daughter and her friends, because I was actually, up till now, I was a bit embarrassed. Like, your dad's doing some weird things in the basement. You know, you've got a TV show. But listening, John, to you, both Johns, here's Dr. Cobb, you know, brilliant Whiteheadian scholar. And here's an unschooled peasant boy from Manchester. I don't know where you're from, but
London.
London, who had a near-death experience as an infant in the Blitz, who was unschooled, didn't learn mathematics, couldn't write. And here you became one of the most influential people and one of the most interesting banks in the world. And I think this is such an encouragement to our young people who are stressed about exams and getting their GPA to get through whatever university program. And John, you're just an inspiration to me, because you truly live through osmosis, through love, and I cherish your wisdom.
Well, let's work together to abolish schools. And then
I'm with you on that.
Let's do it.
I'm writing a paper on Ph.D. What should PhDs look like in New World? You know, not your doctor of philosophy, but the love of knowledge, you know.
And children naturally love to learn. And this is not something you have to put them in prison and not for 6 hours a day in order to get them to do.
Yeah.
And
thank you so much, John.
In Europe, the Finns have the most success on continental-wide exams. But they have the least schooling. There's a close correlation between less schooling and more learning.
And more play. The Finns have more playtime.
And wonderment as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, John.
Well, thank you.
Yes, this
Thank
was
you,
very
John.
nice.
It's been a
Amazing.
real honor and a great pleasure. Thank you.